Hi, I'm Rebecca. My sister said she needed help managing Dad's estate while I was deployed overseas, so I gave her power of attorney and trusted her to handle everything fairly. What I didn't know? She'd forge documents, drain every account, and sell our family home while I was dodging IEDs in Afghanistan. Then she threw herself a housewarming party in her new mansion, bought with my inheritance money. But when I got back and the lawyer revealed Dad's hidden clause, everything changed. Ever. Had someone steal your future while you were fighting for your country? Before we dive in, tell me what time you're watching and where you're from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear about family betrayals that hit when you least expected them. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I stepped off that military transport at Fort Campbell, Kentucky on a Tuesday morning that felt like stepping into someone else's life. 18 months in, Afghanistan changes you, but I thought I was coming home to something familiar. The last email from my sister Vanessa had been cheerful enough. Don't worry about anything, Becca. I've got Dad's affairs all sorted out. Focus on staying safe over there. Those words felt like a warm hug when I read them in a dusty outpost outside Kandahar. Dad had died of a heart attack 6 months into my deployment. Massive, sudden, gone before the paramedics could even get him stable. The Red Cross notification came through my commanding officer at 3 in the morning, and I remember sitting in that cramped office trailer, staring at the fluorescent light, buzzing overhead, trying to process that the man who taught me how to change oil and throw a curveball was just gone. The Army offered emergency leave, but we were in the middle of a critical operation. Dad always said duty came first, and Vanessa promised she could handle everything until I got back. Vanessa was my older sister by 4 years, the one who stayed close to home while I joined the military right out of high school. She'd married. Her college boyfriend lived 20 minutes from Dad's house in Maryville, Tennessee, and seemed to have the whole domestic life figured out. When Mom died of cancer when I was 16, Vanessa stepped into that caretaker role naturally. She organized the funeral, helped Dad adjust to living alone, brought him casseroles on Sundays. It made sense that she'd be the one to handle his estate when I couldn't be there. The inheritance wasn't massive by rich people standards, but for a working-class family from East Tennessee, it was everything. Dad had been a mechanic for 37 years, never missed a day of work, saved every penny he could. The house was paid off, worth about $180,000 in a decent neighborhood with mature oak trees and a 2-car garage he'd built himself. There was his retirement account, about $95,000 that he'd been careful with, never touching the principal. The life insurance policy, another $150,000. His truck, a 2019 Ford F-150 he'd babied like it was made of gold. All told, close to $500,000 that represented a lifetime of getting up at 5:30 every morning and working with his hands until his knuckles were permanently stained with motor oil. That money meant everything to me, but not in a greedy way. It meant I could finish my degree when I got out of the service. It meant I could maybe buy a small house, start the photography business I'd been dreaming about since I was a kid with a disposable camera. It meant security, opportunity, choices. Dad used to say money wasn't everything, but having it sure made everything easier. He'd worked so hard so that Vanessa and I would have something to build on, something he never had when he was starting out. The funeral happened via video call from a base in Kabul. I sat in a communications tent, 8,000 miles away, watching. My father's casket being lowered into Tennessee soil while helicopters buzzed overhead and sand worked its way into everything I owned. Vanessa handled it all. The service, the burial, the reception afterward. She sent me photos of the flowers, the American flag draped over his casket, the old mechanics from his shop who came to pay their respects. I saved every single image, on my phone, grateful that she was there to honor him properly when I couldn't be. During those months overseas, Vanessa would send updates through email. Getting the house appraised this week. Met with the lawyer about probate. Insurance company is processing everything. The messages were always brief but reassuring. She'd include photos sometimes. Dad's truck parked in her driveway. Boxes of his belongings organized in her garage. The house looking well-maintained, lawn mowed, gutters cleaned. It felt like she was preserving everything, keeping it safe for when I returned. I trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? She was family. She'd been nothing but supportive when I enlisted, sending care packages filled with homemade cookies and magazines. When I made sergeant, she was the first person to call and congratulate me. When I told her about the rough missions, the friends we'd lost, the weight of carrying an M4 through villages where every shadow could hide danger, she listened without judgment. She understood that military life was hard on relationships, hard on mental health, hard on everything. She promised to be my anchor to home. The power of attorney documents had been straightforward. Dad's lawyer, an old family friend named Mr. Harrison, had walked Vanessa through everything. Since I was unreachable for months at a time and couldn't sign papers or make decisions about time-sensitive matters, it made perfect sense to give her temporary authority to handle the estate. The will was simple. Everything split 50-50 between Vanessa and me. No complicated trusts or conditions. Dad believed in keeping things simple. "When I'm gone," he used to say, "I want you girls to have what you need, not a bunch of legal headaches." But trusting Vanessa wasn't just about logistics. It was about who we'd been as sisters. Growing up, she was the one who helped me with homework when Dad was working late. She taught me how to parallel park, how to do winged eyeliner, how to talk to boys without stumbling over my words. When I decided to join the Army instead of going straight to college like everyone expected, she was initially worried but ultimately supportive. "You've always been braver than me," she said the day I left for basic training. "Just promise me you'll come back in one piece." That bravery felt tested every day in Afghanistan. Convoys through areas where improvised explosive devices turned ordinary roads into minefields. Patrols through markets where friendly faces could mask hostile intentions. The constant hypervigilance that came with knowing that relaxing for even a moment could mean not coming home. But the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was the isolation from everything that mattered. Missing birthdays, holidays, the simple comfort of familiar faces around a dinner table. Vanessa's emails became my lifeline to normalcy. She'd write about her kids, how 7-year-old Emma was doing in 2nd grade, how 4-year-old Tyler was obsessed with dinosaurs and insisted on wearing his Triceratops costume to grocery stores. She'd mention her husband Mark's job at the credit union, their plans to renovate their kitchen, the mundane details of civilian life that felt like luxury when you were living in a tent and eating MREs. Those updates reminded me what I was fighting for, what I'd return to when my deployment ended. The months crawled by. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall to the brutal winter that made everything harder. My unit lost 2 soldiers to an IED in November, guys I'd eaten breakfast with that morning, guys who'd shown me pictures of their girlfriends and talked about what they wanted to do when they got home. Death in a war zone isn't like death back home. It's sudden, violent, and it leaves you questioning everything while still having to function, still having to complete the mission, still having to be strong for the soldiers who look to you for leadership. But through it all, Vanessa's messages kept coming. "Everything's handled here. Dad would be proud of how you're serving. Focus on staying safe and coming home." Those words carried me through the worst days, the ones where I wondered if any of this made sense, if the sacrifices were worth it, if the people back home really understood what we were doing over there. I counted down the days until redeployment like a prisoner marking time on a cell wall. Each morning brought me one day closer to Tennessee, one day closer to dealing with Dad's death properly, one day closer to starting the next chapter of my life with the foundation he'd worked so hard to build for me. The relationship between Vanessa and me wasn't built overnight. It was forged through decades of shared experiences that made trusting her feel as natural as breathing. She was 4 years older, which meant she'd always been my protector, my guide, my example of how to navigate the world. When we were kids in our small house on Maple Street, she was the one who checked for monsters under my bed, who taught me how to ride a bike without training wheels, who braided my hair for school pictures when Mom was too tired from chemotherapy. Treatments. Vanessa had been born responsible. Even as a 10-year-old, she was the one reminding me to brush my teeth, making sure I had my homework packed, walking me to the bus stop on rainy mornings. When Mom got sick, Vanessa stepped up in ways that still amaze me. She was only 14 when Mom started her first round of chemo, but she learned how to do laundry, how to cook simple meals, how to keep our house running when Dad was working double shifts to pay for medical bills, and Mom was too weak to get out of bed. I remember watching her those years, seeing how she never complained about missing sleepovers, because she needed to help Mom to the bathroom, or skipping school dances because someone had to watch me while Dad drove Mom to treatments in Knoxville. She did it all with this quiet strength that I admired and tried to emulate. When Mom died my junior year of high school, Vanessa postponed her plans to transfer to University of Tennessee so she could stay local at the community college and help Dad adjust to being a single parent. That's who Vanessa was, the caretaker, the responsible one. The sister who put family first, always. So when I graduated high school and announced I was joining the Army instead of going to college, she was the only one who didn't try to talk me out of it. Dad was worried about me getting hurt. My guidance counselor thought I was throwing away academic opportunities, but Vanessa understood that I needed to find my own path, different from hers, but equally valid. She helped me research military occupational specialties, drove me to the recruiting station for my initial meeting, and was there when I signed my enlistment papers. "You've got Dad's stubborn streak and Mom's heart," she told me that day. "The Army's lucky to get you." When I left for basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, she was the one crying in the driveway, promising to take care of Dad while I was gone. During my first deployment to Iraq, Vanessa sent care packages religiously. Homemade cookies that somehow survived international shipping, magazines, letters written in her careful handwriting that updated me on everything happening back home. She'd include photos of family gatherings I was missing, holiday celebrations, where my empty chair reminded everyone I was serving overseas. Those packages were more valuable than gold when you're living in a forward operating base, where dust coats everything and the nearest familiar face is thousands of miles away. When I came back from Iraq, Vanessa was there at the airport with Dad, holding a welcome home sign she'd made with her kids. Emma was just a toddler then, wide-eyed and clinging to her mother's leg. But Tyler wasn't even born yet. Mark seemed like a good match for her, steady and kind, with an accountant's methodical nature that balanced her more emotional approach to life. They'd bought a modest house in Alcoa, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable, with a yard big enough for the kids to play in. Vanessa had always been good with money, careful in ways I never was. While I spent my Army paychecks on travel and experiences during leave time, she and Mark were building savings accounts and planning for their children's college funds. She researched every major purchase, compared prices, read consumer reports. When they bought their first house, she'd spent months studying the real estate market, getting pre-approved for mortgages, finding the best interest rates. Financial responsibility came naturally to her. That's why it made perfect sense for her to handle Dad's estate. She understood legal documents, insurance policies, investment accounts. She'd helped Dad set up his retirement savings years earlier, had been the one to convince him to increase his life insurance coverage when he turned 60. She knew where he kept his important papers, understood his financial habits, had keys to his house and access to his safe deposit box. More than that, she understood Dad in ways I was still learning. While I was off seeing the world through Army deployments, She was the one having Sunday dinners with him, listening to his stories about work, helping him adjust to retirement. She knew he'd been setting aside extra money for our inheritances, working overtime jobs on weekends to boost the amount he could leave us. She understood how important it was to him that we be financially secure, that we have opportunities he'd never had. Dad had grown up poor in rural Appalachia, one of 6 kids whose father died in a mining accident when Dad was 12. He'd learned early that financial security was precious, that you couldn't take it for granted, that providing for your family was a man's most important responsibility. Every dollar he saved for Vanessa and me represented sacrifice: extra hours at the garage, skipped vacations, secondhand clothes, meals at home instead of restaurants. Vanessa respected that sacrifice in ways I was still learning to appreciate. She knew that our inheritance wasn't just money. It was Dad's legacy, his final gift, his way of ensuring we'd have stability in an uncertain world. She'd been the one to sit with him when he updated his will, to discuss his wishes for how the money should be distributed, to understand his hopes for what we'd do with what he left us. The power of attorney arrangement had been her idea, suggested, during one of our video calls about 6 months before Dad died. If something happens to him while you're deployed, we need to make sure everything can be handled quickly, she'd said. Probate can take months, and there might be time-sensitive decisions about insurance policies or property taxes. It made sense. The military had taught me the importance of contingency planning, having backup systems in place for when primary plans failed. Dad's lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had known our family for 20 years. He'd handled Mom's estate when she died, had helped Dad with various legal matters over the years, had drawn up the wills and power of attorney documents. He trusted Vanessa completely, had watched her grow from a responsible teenager into a dependable adult. When he explained the power of attorney to me over the phone, he assured me that Vanessa would only use it if absolutely necessary, and only for routine estate management tasks. The legal language was straightforward enough for someone with military experience in following orders and understanding chain of command. Vanessa would have the authority to access Dad's accounts, pay his bills, make decisions about his property, and handle any legal matters that arose. The power was broad but temporary, designed to ensure that nothing important got delayed while I was unreachable in Afghanistan. It would expire automatically once I returned and could take over handling things myself. What I didn't understand then was how much power that document actually gave her. The ability to access every bank account, every investment, every asset Dad owned. The authority to make decisions about selling property, transferring money, even changing beneficiaries on certain accounts. The legal system was designed to trust family members acting in good faith, with minimal oversight when someone held power of attorney. It assumed that family wouldn't betray family, that love and loyalty would prevent abuse. Vanessa had always been trustworthy with financial matters. When we were teenagers and Dad gave us each $20 for movie nights, she was the one who saved half for later while I spent mine immediately on popcorn and candy. When she got her first job at 16, working at a local clothing store, she opened a savings account and deposited most of every paycheck. She'd been the treasurer of her senior class, managing funds for prom and graduation activities with meticulous attention to detail. Even in our adult relationship, she'd proven reliable with money matters. When I needed someone to handle my finances, during my first deployment, she'd managed my accounts perfectly, paying my bills on time, monitoring for fraudulent charges, even finding me a better savings account with higher interest rates. She'd never spent a penny that wasn't hers, never made a decision without consulting me first, never given me any reason to doubt her integrity. That's what made her betrayal so devastating when I finally discovered it. It wasn't just about the money she stole. It was about the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about who she was, about our relationship, about the family we'd built together through years of shared experiences and mutual support. The woman I trusted with my father's legacy wasn't the sister I thought I knew, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Back then, preparing for deployment, Signing those power of attorney papers felt like the most natural thing in the world. Vanessa was family. She was responsible. She was the only person I trusted completely to honor Dad's memory and protect what he'd worked so hard to build for us. The call came on a Thursday evening in March, 2 weeks before Dad's sudden heart attack. I was sitting in the communications tent at Forward Operating Base Shank, trying to get a decent connection for our weekly family video call. The satellite internet was spotty as usual, cutting in and out with that frustrating delay that made normal conversation nearly impossible. Vanessa's face kept freezing on the screen, her voice echoing with a robotic quality that made everything sound urgent even when it wasn't. "Becca, I need to talk to you about something important," she said, her image pixelated and breaking apart. The connection stabilized just enough for me to see her sitting in her kitchen, Mark visible in the background washing dishes while the kids played in the living room. She looked tired, more worn down than usual, with dark circles under her eyes, that I attributed to the stress of managing 2 young children while Mark worked long hours at the credit union. "What's going on?" I asked, adjusting my headset and hoping the connection would hold long enough for a real conversation. These calls were precious to me, the only regular contact I had with home that felt personal rather than official. The time difference meant I was usually talking to them late at night my time, after long days of patrols and training exercises, when I was exhausted but desperate for the normalcy their voices provided. "It's about Dad," she continued, and my stomach immediately tightened. Dad was 68, still working part-time at the garage even though he could have retired completely. He'd been having some minor health issues, high blood pressure, joint pain from decades of physical labor, but nothing that seemed immediately threatening. He's been talking about updating some of his legal documents, and he's worried about what would happen if something occurred while you're deployed. The concern made sense. Dad had always been a planner, someone who worried about contingencies and tried to prepare for every possible scenario. When Mom got sick, he'd spent hours researching treatment options, insurance coverage, what-if situations that might arise. It was his way of maintaining control in situations that felt overwhelming and unpredictable. The idea that his death might leave legal and financial complications for his daughters would definitely keep him awake at night. "What kind of documents?" I asked, though I suspected I knew where this conversation was heading. We'd talked about estate planning before, in general terms, during my previous deployment. Dad had a will, life insurance, retirement accounts with beneficiaries listed. But the military had taught me that legal documents needed to account for unusual circumstances, like communication blackouts or extended overseas assignments where normal procedures might not work. "Power of attorney," Vanessa said, her voice cutting through the static. "Mr. Harrison thinks it would be smart to have someone who can act on your behalf if needed, just temporarily, until you can get back and handle things yourself. Dad doesn't want any of his affairs getting stuck in legal limbo if something happens and you can't be reached for weeks at a time." The logic was sound, even obvious. Communication from Afghanistan was unreliable at best. There were weeks when operational security prevented any outside contact, when we were too deep in hostile territory, or too focused on critical missions to maintain regular schedules. If Dad died during one of those communication blackouts, important decisions about his estate could be delayed for months, creating problems with property taxes, insurance deadlines, or time-sensitive financial matters. "He wants you to have power of attorney?" I asked, though again, the answer seemed obvious. Vanessa was the responsible one, the one who lived nearby, the one who understood financial and legal matters. She was also the one Dad trusted implicitly, who'd been helping him with various administrative tasks since Mom died. It made perfect sense from every practical standpoint. "Only if you're comfortable with it," she said quickly. "I know it's a big responsibility, and I don't want you to feel like I'm trying to take over or anything. It would just be temporary, just for emergency situations where decisions can't wait for you to get back. Mr. Harrison says we can set it up with specific limitations, so I can only use it for essential estate matters. I appreciated her sensitivity about the issue. Power of attorney was serious business, giving someone broad authority over financial and legal decisions. But Vanessa had earned my trust through years of reliable, careful behavior with money and family responsibilities. She'd handled my finances during my previous deployment without any issues, paying my bills on time and even finding ways to save me money. She understood the weight of the responsibility she was offering to take on. "What does Dad think about it?" I asked, wanting to make sure this was his idea rather than something Vanessa had suggested to him. Dad was proud and independent, not someone who liked asking for help or admitting he needed backup plans. If he was bringing up power of attorney, it meant he was genuinely worried about potential complications. "He's the one who suggested it," she said, and I could hear Dad's voice in the background, talking to one of the kids. "He's been reading about probate delays and legal complications that can happen when family members are overseas or unreachable. You know how he gets when he starts worrying about something. He researches it to death until he's found every possible problem that could occur." That was definitely Dad. When I'd first deployed to Iraq, he'd spent weeks learning about military communication systems, time zones, mail delivery to combat zones, everything he could possibly need to know to stay connected with me. When Mom was going through cancer treatment, he'd become an expert on insurance policies, treatment protocols, patient advocacy procedures. Knowledge was his way of feeling prepared for situations that were largely beyond his control. "Mr. Harrison says it's pretty standard for military families," Vanessa continued. "He's handled similar situations before when service members are deployed and family emergencies arise. The documents can be written to expire automatically when you return, and they only cover specific types of decisions, paying bills, handling insurance claims, that sort of thing." The timeline made sense. 2. My deployment was scheduled to last another 10 months, with the possibility of extension depending on mission requirements. 10 months was a long time for legal and financial matters to potentially sit unresolved if something happened to Dad. Even a minor delay in handling insurance claims or property taxes could create significant complications for his estate. "I do trust you completely," I told her, and I meant it. "If Dad thinks it's necessary, and you're willing to take on the responsibility, then let's do it. I just want to make sure we're doing what's best for everyone involved." The relief in her voice was obvious. "I'll take good care of everything, I promise. And I'll keep you updated on any decisions I have to make, even if it's just routine stuff. This is really just insurance, in case something unexpected happens, and we need to act quickly." We spent the rest of the call discussing the logistics. Mr. Harrison would prepare the documents, Dad would review them carefully, and Vanessa would bring them to me for electronic signature during our next scheduled video call. The power of attorney would be specific and limited, covering only estate-related matters and expiring automatically upon my return from deployment. It seemed like a reasonable precaution, the kind of advanced planning that responsible adults did to protect their families. After we ended the call, I felt good about the decision. Vanessa was reliable, careful with money, and understood the importance of honoring Dad's wishes. She'd been helping him with various tasks since Mom died, and he trusted her judgment completely. The power of attorney would give him peace of mind, knowing that his affairs could be handled properly even if I was unreachable when something happened. The documents arrived by email 2 weeks later, just 3 days before Dad's heart attack. Mr. Harrison had written them clearly, with specific language limiting Vanessa's authority to essential estate matters. I reviewed everything carefully, asked questions about sections I didn't understand, and felt confident that we were creating a safety net rather than opening the door to potential problems. I signed the documents electronically during our next video call, with Dad and Mr. Harrison witnessing the process. Dad looked relieved to have everything in place, and Vanessa promised again to use the authority only if absolutely necessary. The whole process felt routine, responsible, the kind of careful planning that prevented problems rather than creating them. None of us could have predicted that Dad would be dead within 72 hours, or that the documents we'd signed as a precaution would become the primary legal framework for handling his entire estate. None of us imagined that the power of attorney I'd granted to protect my father's legacy would become the tool used to destroy it. But at the time, signing those papers felt like the most natural thing in the world. I was entrusting my sister with legal authority because I trusted her with everything else that mattered. The decision seemed obvious, responsible, even inevitable given our family dynamics and my military obligations. Looking back, I realized that was the moment everything changed, even though none of us knew it then. The moment I signed my name to those documents was the moment I gave Vanessa the keys to everything Dad had worked for, everything he'd saved, everything he'd planned to leave us. It was the moment trust became vulnerability, and family loyalty became the weapon that would eventually be used against me. The flight home from Afghanistan felt like traveling through time zones of grief. 26 hours of airports, layovers, and cramped airline seats gave me too much time to think about everything that had changed while I was gone. Dad was dead. The funeral was over. Vanessa had handled everything. I kept replaying those facts like a mantra, trying to make them feel real instead of like someone else's nightmare I'd accidentally stepped into. Fort Campbell's processing center was efficient as always, but the paperwork for permanent change of station felt surreal when I knew I was going home to bury my father rather than celebrate completing my deployment. The casualty assistance officer had been helpful during the redeployment process, making sure I understood my bereavement leave options and connecting me with grief counseling resources. But nothing really prepares you for the weight of returning to a world that's moved on without you. I drove my rental car through Tennessee back roads that looked exactly the same as when I'd left, which somehow made everything feel more wrong. The mountains were still there, the same gas stations and fast food restaurants, the same billboards advertising local businesses, but Dad wasn't waiting for me anymore. The house I'd grown up in belonged to someone else now. Everything familiar had been rearranged while I was learning to sleep through mortar attacks and patrol hostile villages. Vanessa had insisted I stay with her family rather than getting a hotel. "You shouldn't be alone right now," she'd said during our last video call before I left Afghanistan. "The kids are excited to see Aunt Becca, and Mark's been asking about your deployment stories. We've got the guest room all set up for you." Her voice had that careful, nurturing tone she'd used when Mom was sick, like she was managing a crisis that required delicate handling. Their house looked different when I pulled into the driveway. Bigger somehow, though I couldn't immediately identify what had changed. The landscaping was more elaborate than I remembered, with professional-looking flower beds and decorative stonework that must have cost thousands of dollars. A new deck extended off the back of the house, visible through the side yard, with expensive-looking outdoor furniture arranged around a fire pit I'd never seen before. Emma and Tyler ran out to greet me before I'd even turned off the engine. They'd grown so much during my deployment that I almost didn't recognize them. Emma was tall and gangly now, missing her front teeth, chattering excitedly about second grade and her new bicycle. Tyler had transformed from a toddler into a real little boy, still obsessed with dinosaurs but now able to recite complex facts about different species and time periods. "Aunt Becca! Aunt Becca!" Tyler shouted, launching himself at my legs with the fearless enthusiasm only 4-year-olds possess. "Mom said you fought bad guys. Did you see any real tanks? Do you have a sword?" Emma was more reserved but equally excited, hanging back slightly while Tyler bombarded me with questions. "Dad said you were very brave," she said seriously. "And that you helped keep America safe? Are you sad about Grandpa being in heaven?" The directness of children's questions about death and military service hit me harder than I'd expected. I knelt down to their level, gathering them both into a hug that smelled like apple juice and playground dirt. "I missed you both so much," I said, meaning it completely. "And yes, I'm very sad about Grandpa, but I'm happy to be home with you." Vanessa appeared in the doorway, looking polished in a way that seemed effortless, but probably wasn't. Her hair was styled differently, shorter and more sophisticated than the practical mom cut she'd had before. She was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, expensive-looking jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly army housing allowance. Everything about her appearance suggested prosperity, success, upward mobility. "Welcome home, soldier," she said, wrapping me in a hug that felt genuine but somehow performative, like she was conscious of being watched. "I'm so glad you made it back safely. We have so much to catch up on." Mark emerged from the house looking tired but pleased to see me. He'd gained some weight during my deployment, and there were new lines around his eyes that made him look older than his 32 years. But his handshake was firm, his smile warm, and he immediately started asking thoughtful questions about my deployment experience without being pushy about details I might not want to share. "Vanessa's been amazing through all of this," he said, as we unloaded my duffel bags from the rental car. "Handling your dad's estate while managing everything here at home. I don't know how she's kept it all together, honestly. The paperwork alone would have buried me." The guest room was immaculate, decorated with new furniture and bedding that looked like it came from an expensive home goods store. Fresh flowers sat on the nightstand, and there were thoughtful touches like extra pillows, a selection of books, and a basket of snacks and toiletries. Someone had put considerable time and money into making the space welcoming. I wanted everything to be perfect. "For your homecoming," Vanessa said, hovering in the doorway while I set down my bags. "I know this isn't how we planned your return, but I wanted you to feel comfortable and taken care of while you're processing everything." The word processing stuck with me. It sounded clinical, like grief was an administrative task that could be completed efficiently with proper planning. But I appreciated her effort to create a comfortable space, and I was genuinely grateful not to be alone in some sterile hotel room while adjusting to being back in the civilian world. Dinner that evening was elaborate by their usual standards. Vanessa had prepared my favorite meal from childhood, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans, along with homemade rolls and a chocolate cake for dessert. The dining room table was set with dishes I didn't recognize, elegant ceramic plates that replaced the simple stoneware I remembered from previous visits. "This is incredible," I said, genuinely impressed by the spread. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble at all," Vanessa replied, serving generous portions while Mark opened a bottle of wine that looked expensive. "I wanted tonight to be special, a proper welcome home for our hero." The conversation during dinner focused on safe topics, my deployment experiences that were appropriate to share in front of children, updates on extended family members, local news from Maryville that had accumulated during my absence. Emma and Tyler dominated much of the discussion, excited to have a captive audience for their stories about school, friends, and various childhood adventures. But I found myself distracted by details that seemed slightly off. The wine Mark had opened cost more than they usually spent on groceries for a week. The flowers throughout the house were fresh and professionally arranged, not the grocery store bouquets Vanessa typically bought. Everything felt more expensive, more polished, more upscale than their previous lifestyle had supported. "Business. Must be good at the credit union," I commented to Mark during a lull in the children's chatter. "The house looks amazing. You've done a lot of improvements since I was last here." Mark and Vanessa exchanged a quick glance that I almost missed. "We've been fortunate," Mark said carefully. "Got some bonuses this year, and Vanessa's been smart about investing. She's got a real talent for financial planning." Vanessa smiled modestly. "I've been learning a lot about money management, reading books, taking online courses. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you really focus on building wealth instead of just spending everything you earn." After dinner, we sat on the new deck while the kids played in the backyard. The outdoor furniture was clearly high-end, with thick cushions and a matching umbrella that probably cost more than my car payment. A built-in grill occupied one corner of the deck, the kind of stainless steel appliance that's serious cooking, enthusiasts invested in when money wasn't a major consideration. "This deck is incredible," I said, running my hand along the smooth railing. "When did you build it?" "Just finished it last month," Mark replied, settling into one of the cushioned chairs with obvious satisfaction. "Vanessa designed the whole thing. She's got great taste when it comes to home improvements." "It wasn't cheap," Vanessa added with a laugh that sounded slightly nervous. "But we decided life's too short not to invest in things that make us happy. Dad's death really put things in perspective for me. You never know how much time you have, so you might as well enjoy what you've worked for." The mention of Dad's death felt jarring in the context of their obvious prosperity. They were talking about investing in happiness and enjoying life while I was still processing the fact that he was gone. But I reminded myself that everyone handles grief differently, and maybe focusing on home improvements had been Vanessa's way of coping with loss. Later that evening, after the kids were in bed and Mark had gone to watch television, Vanessa and I sat in her living room with cups of coffee and began the conversation I'd been dreading. She pulled out a thick folder of documents and set it on the coffee table, between us. "I know this is a lot to process right after getting home," she said gently. "But I thought you should see everything I've been handling while you were deployed. I've tried to keep meticulous records so you'd understand every decision I made." The folder contained bank statements, insurance forms, legal documents, and receipts organized with the kind of attention to detail that had always characterized Vanessa's approach to important matters. Everything was color-coded, labeled, and arranged chronologically. It looked professional, thorough, exactly what I would have expected from someone handling complex financial responsibilities. "Dad's estate was more complicated than we realized," she continued, opening to a section of bank statements. There were multiple accounts, different insurance policies, investment funds that required immediate decisions to avoid penalties. I had to move quickly on several things to protect the value of what he left us. I nodded, trying to follow her explanations while fighting the exhaustion that came from jet lag and emotional overload. The numbers on the bank statements blurred together, and the legal terminology felt foreign after months of military jargon and combat operations. I trusted Vanessa to explain everything clearly, to help me understand what had happened while I was unreachable in Afghanistan. But something felt wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what was bothering me. Maybe it was the timing, trying to process complex financial information while still adjusting to being back in civilian life. Maybe it was the contrast between their obvious prosperity and the serious tone Vanessa was using to discuss Dad's estate. Or maybe it was just grief making everything feel surreal and disconnected. "Take your time going through everything," Vanessa said, closing the folder and setting it beside me on the couch. "I know it's overwhelming, but I want you to feel confident that I handled everything exactly the way Dad would have wanted." The next morning, I woke up disoriented and groggy from jet lag, my internal clock still operating on Afghanistan time. The guest room was quiet except for the distant sounds of Mark getting ready for work and the kids eating breakfast downstairs. I lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the fact that I was really home, that Dad was really gone, that my life had fundamentally changed while I was halfway around the world. I showered and dressed in civilian clothes that felt strange after months of military uniforms, then made my way downstairs to find Vanessa in the kitchen, still in her pajamas, making coffee with an expensive-looking espresso machine I didn't remember seeing before. The kids were at the table eating cereal from bowls that matched the elegant dinnerware from the previous evening. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty," Vanessa said with a smile that seemed forced. "I thought you might sleep until noon. Jet lag is brutal coming back from overseas." "Still adjusting to being in a real bed," I replied, accepting the coffee she offered. It was strong and perfectly prepared, the kind of quality you'd expect from a high-end coffee shop rather than a home kitchen. "Where did this machine come from? It's fancier than anything I saw at the base." "Birthday present from Mark," she said quickly. "He knows I'm addicted to good coffee. Figured it was cheaper than going to Starbucks every day." The espresso machine looked like it cost more than most people spent on coffee in a year, but I didn't comment. Maybe Mark's bonuses at the credit union had been more substantial than I'd realized. Or maybe they'd been saving up for luxuries while I was deployed, investing in home improvements and quality appliances while they had the chance. After breakfast, Vanessa suggested we visit Dad's grave before dealing with any estate paperwork. "I thought you might want some time there by yourself," she said gently. "I can drop you off and pick you up later, or stay with you if you'd prefer company." The cemetery was exactly as I'd seen it in the photos Vanessa had sent during the funeral, but being there in person hit me with unexpected force. Dad's headstone was simple granite with his name, military service dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Father and Grandfather." The grave was well maintained, with fresh flowers that Vanessa must have placed recently. I knelt beside the headstone and tried to find words for everything I'd been unable to say during our last phone conversation before he died. The anger I felt about missing his funeral, the guilt about being overseas when he needed me, the grief that felt too large for my body to contain. I'd been trained to compartmentalize emotions during combat operations, but civilian grief felt different, more chaotic and overwhelming. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," I whispered to the headstone. "Vanessa says you understood, but I should have been here. You deserved better than a daughter who was too far away to hold your hand when you were dying." The cemetery was quiet, except for the distant sound of lawnmowers and the rustle of wind through the mature oak trees. I sat there for nearly an hour, trying to process the finality of death, while surrounded by the peaceful order of carefully maintained graves and memorial gardens. It felt surreal to be having this conversation with a piece of stone instead of the man who'd taught me to change a tire and throw a curveball. When Vanessa picked me up, she was quiet during the drive back to her house, respecting my need to process what I'd experienced at the cemetery. But as we pulled into her driveway, she cleared her throat and said, "I thought this afternoon might be a good time to go through Dad's house. We need to decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to do with the property itself." The drive to Dad's house took 15 minutes through neighborhoods I'd known since childhood. Nothing had changed much. The same small houses with carefully maintained yards, the same corner store where Dad used to buy lottery tickets every Friday, the same elementary school where Vanessa and I had learned to read and write. But everything felt different because Dad wouldn't be waiting for us when we arrived. His house looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile somehow, like a movie set that had been abandoned after filming Wrapped. The lawn was overgrown, and newspapers had accumulated on the front porch despite Vanessa's promise to cancel his subscriptions. Paint was peeling around the front door, and the gutters needed cleaning. It looked like a house where no one lived anymore. "I've been meaning to get the yard work caught up," Vanessa said apologetically as we walked up the front steps. "But between managing the estate and keeping up with my own family, there hasn't been time for everything." She unlocked the front door with keys that looked worn from frequent use, and we stepped into the living room where Dad had spent his final years watching television and reading automotive magazines. The air smelled stale and dusty, like a house that had been closed up for too long. Furniture was covered with sheets, and family photos had been removed from their usual places on the mantel and side tables. "I packed up most of the personal items," Vanessa explained, gesturing toward boxes stacked in the corner. "Pictures, documents, things I thought you'd want to go through when you got home. The furniture is mostly in good condition, but it's not worth much. We'll probably donate most of it to charity." I walked through the house slowly, touching surfaces and opening drawers, trying to feel some connection to the man who'd lived here. His bedroom was the hardest, with the hospital bed that had been delivered during his final weeks still dominating the space. Vanessa had stripped it of linens, but seeing where he'd spent his last days made his death feel more real than any cemetery visit. "The medical equipment needs to be returned," Vanessa said from the doorway. "I've been putting it off because it felt too final, but the rental company keeps calling about pickup." Dad's home office was exactly as I remembered it, with his desk, covered in neat stacks of papers and his filing cabinet, organized with the methodical precision that had characterized his approach to everything. But when I opened drawers that should have contained important documents, they were empty. Bank statements, insurance policies, investment records. Everything was gone. I moved all the financial documents to my house, Vanessa explained when I asked about the empty files. It seemed safer to keep everything in one place while I was managing the estate. Plus, some of the paperwork needed to be updated with new addresses and contact information. The explanation made sense, but something felt wrong about the emptiness of Dad's filing system. He'd been obsessive about keeping records, maintaining copies of everything important in multiple locations. Even if Vanessa had moved the originals, there should have been backup files, duplicate statements, photocopies of important documents. The complete absence of any financial records felt strange. In the kitchen, I opened the refrigerator to find it completely empty and unplugged. The pantry shelves were bare except for a few canned goods that had been left behind. Even Dad's collection of coffee mugs, accumulated over decades of working at various automotive shops, had been packed away. The house felt stripped of personality, reduced to its basic structure without the accumulated details that made it a home. "When did you clean everything out?" I asked, running my fingers along the empty shelves. "I've been working on it gradually," Vanessa replied, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Dad had accumulated so much stuff over the years. Most of it wasn't valuable, just sentimental. I saved anything I thought you might want, but there was a lot of junk that needed to go." The garage was the most shocking transformation. Dad's workshop, where he'd spent countless hours working on cars and teaching me basic mechanical skills, had been completely cleared out. His tool collection, worth thousands of dollars and accumulated over a lifetime of professional work, was gone. The workbenches were bare, and even the pegboard where he'd hung his hand tools had been removed from the walls. "What happened to all his tools?" I asked, unable to hide my shock. Those tools represented Dad's professional identity, his expertise, his pride in craftsmanship that had sustained our family for decades. "I sold them to Jimmy Patterson at the garage," Vanessa said, not meeting my eyes. Dad always said Jimmy was the only one who really understood the value of quality tools. I got a good price for them, and I knew Dad would approve of them going to someone who'd appreciate their worth. The explanation sounded reasonable, but it felt wrong. Dad had always planned to leave his tools to me, understanding that I'd inherited his mechanical aptitude and appreciation for well-made equipment. We'd talked about it during my previous deployment, how those tools would help me start my own automotive business when I got out of the Army. Selling them without consulting me felt like a betrayal of Dad's wishes, but I was too emotionally exhausted to argue about it immediately. Everything about being home felt overwhelming: the jet lag, the grief, the unfamiliarity of civilian life after months of military routine. I told myself that Vanessa had made practical decisions under difficult circumstances, that she'd done her best to manage an impossible situation while I was unreachable overseas. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through boxes of personal items that Vanessa had saved: family photos, Dad's military service records, Mom's jewelry, books, and mementos that held sentimental value but no significant monetary worth. Everything important seemed to be there, carefully preserved and organized with Vanessa's characteristic attention to detail. "I thought you might want to take some of this back to your apartment," she said as we sorted through Dad's collection of vintage automotive magazines. "When you get your own place, I mean. These things shouldn't just sit in storage forever." The casual mention of your apartment reminded me that I didn't actually have anywhere to live. The Army had processed my discharge, but I hadn't had time to find housing or make plans for civilian life. Everything had been put on hold while I dealt with Dad's death and the logistics of coming home early from deployment. "I guess I need to figure out where I'm going to live," I said, more to myself than to Vanessa. "I haven't even thought about finding an apartment or getting a job. The last few weeks have been such a whirlwind." "You're welcome to stay with us as long as you need," Vanessa said quickly. "The kids love having you here, And it's probably good for you not to be alone while you're adjusting to everything. Civilian life is hard enough without adding grief and isolation to the mix. As we locked up Dad's house and drove back to Vanessa's neighborhood, I found myself looking more carefully at the changes in her lifestyle. The expensive coffee machine, the home improvements, the high-end outdoor furniture, the designer clothes. Everything suggested a significant increase in their household income during my deployment. But Mark's job at the credit union, while stable, wasn't the kind of position that typically generated dramatic salary increases or substantial bonuses. "You and Mark seem to be doing really well financially," I commented as we pulled into their driveway. "The house looks amazing with all the improvements you've made." "We've been blessed," Vanessa replied, but her tone suggested she didn't want to elaborate. "Mark got promoted to assistant manager, and I've been doing some freelance bookkeeping for local businesses. It's amazing how much you can save when you really focus on your financial goals." That evening, after dinner and after the kids were in bed, I sat in the guest room with the folder of estate documents Vanessa had prepared. The jet lag was making it difficult to concentrate, but I wanted to understand what had happened to Dad's assets while I was deployed. The paperwork was comprehensive but confusing, filled with legal terminology and financial details that were hard to follow without background knowledge. According to the documents, Dad's estate had been valued at approximately $425,000, including his house, retirement accounts, life insurance, and personal property. But the final distribution statements showed significantly less money actually available for inheritance. Various expenses had reduced the total: funeral costs, legal fees, property maintenance, administrative charges that seemed higher than I would have expected. The more I studied the papers, the more questions I had. But my exhaustion was overwhelming, and the numbers kept blurring together in ways that made comprehensive analysis impossible. I decided to review everything more carefully the next day, when I could think more clearly and ask Vanessa to explain the discrepancies I thought I was seeing. I fell asleep that night with a nagging sense that something was wrong, but I couldn't identify what was bothering me. Maybe it was just the disorientation of being back in civilian life, the grief of losing Dad, and the overwhelming nature of handling his estate. Maybe I was reading too much into details that had perfectly reasonable explanations. But deep down, I was beginning to suspect that the sister I trusted completely might not be the person I thought she was. The unraveling began with a phone call 3 days later. I was sitting at Vanessa's kitchen table, still struggling through the estate documents while she busied herself with laundry and household tasks, when her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her face went pale. "I need to take this," she said quickly, stepping out onto the deck and sliding the glass door shut behind her. Through the window, I could see her pacing back and forth, gesturing emphatically while speaking in hushed tones. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, and when she came back inside, she looked visibly shaken. "Everything okay?" I asked, looking up from a bank statement that showed several large withdrawals I didn't understand. "Just some paperwork. Issues with Dad's insurance company," she said, not meeting my eyes. "You know how these bureaucrats are. They make everything more complicated than it needs to be." But something about her demeanor suggested the call had been more serious than routine insurance paperwork. She seemed distracted for the rest of the morning, checking her phone frequently and jumping slightly whenever it buzzed with notifications. When Mark came home for lunch, they had a whispered conversation in the hallway that stopped abruptly when I walked past on my way to the bathroom. That afternoon, while Vanessa was picking up the kids from school, I decided to call Mr. Harrison directly. I'd been putting off contacting Dad's lawyer, assuming that Vanessa had handled all the necessary legal communications. But the estate documents raised questions that I couldn't answer on my own, and I wanted to understand the probate process from someone with professional expertise. "Rebecca, it's good to hear from you," Mr. Harrison said when his secretary put me through. "I was wondering when you'd be calling. I know Vanessa's been handling most of the estate matters, but I assumed you'd want to discuss some of the decisions that were made while you were deployed." That's exactly why I'm calling, I said, settling into a quiet corner of Vanessa's living room. I'm trying to understand all the paperwork, but some of the financial details don't make sense to me. Can you walk me through what happened with Dad's assets? There was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted longer than seemed normal. Rebecca, I think there might be some confusion about the estate administration. Have you reviewed the final accounting that Vanessa should have provided? I'm looking at documents she gave me, but I'm having trouble following all the transactions. There seem to be a lot of expenses and transfers that I don't understand. Another pause. I think we need to schedule a meeting to discuss this in person. There are some aspects of the estate settlement that require clarification, and I'd prefer to review everything with you directly, rather than trying to explain complex financial matters over the phone. The gravity in his voice made my stomach tighten. Is there a problem with the estate? Let's just say there are some discrepancies that need to be addressed. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? And Rebecca, you might want to bring your own copy of any documents Vanessa has given you. I spent that evening going through the estate paperwork with new urgency, trying to identify the discrepancies Mr. Harrison had mentioned. The more carefully I read, the more confused I became. Bank transfers were listed without clear explanations. Property sales were documented, but the proceeds weren't accounted for properly. Administrative fees seemed excessively high for routine estate management. Most troubling were the dates on various transactions. Several major financial decisions had been made within days of Dad's death, before the funeral had even taken place. Large sums had been moved between accounts, investments had been liquidated, and property transfers had been initiated with a speed that seemed inconsistent with normal grieving and estate processing timelines. When Vanessa came home from her evening yoga class, I was still sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, trying to make sense of financial records that seemed increasingly suspicious. "You're going to drive yourself crazy trying to understand all that paperwork," she said, hanging her yoga mat in the hallway closet. "Estate accounting is complicated even for professionals. That's why we have lawyers and accountants to handle the technical details." "I called Mr. Harrison today," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "He wants to meet with me tomorrow to review the estate settlement." Vanessa's hand froze on the closet door handle. "What did he say?" "He mentioned some discrepancies that need clarification. Do you know what he's referring to?" She turned around slowly, and for a moment her face showed something I'd never seen before. Fear, maybe, or calculation. But it passed so quickly, I wondered if I'd imagined it. "Probably just routine legal formalities," she said, forcing a smile. "You know how lawyers are. They have to document everything in triplicate and get signatures for the smallest decisions. I'm sure it's nothing serious." But her voice had a strained quality that contradicted her reassuring words. She busied herself with unnecessary tasks in the kitchen, wiping down counters that were already clean and reorganizing items that didn't need organizing. When Mark came downstairs for a late-night snack, they exchanged another of those meaningful glances that made me feel like I was missing crucial information. The next morning, I drove to Mr. Harrison's law office in downtown Maryville, a converted Victorian house that had served the legal needs of our community for decades. His secretary showed me into a wood-paneled office that smelled like old books and furniture polish, where Mr. Harrison sat behind a desk covered with manila folders and legal documents. "Thank you for coming in, Rebecca," he said, gesturing for me to sit in the leather chair across from his desk. "I wanted to discuss some concerns I have about the administration of your father's estate." He opened a thick folder and spread several documents across his desk. "As you know, Vanessa was granted power of attorney to handle estate matters while you were deployed. Initially, her actions were appropriate, paying funeral expenses, maintaining your father's property, handling routine administrative tasks." "Initially?" I asked, my stomach already tightening with anticipation of bad news. "The problems began about 6 weeks after your father's death. Vanessa started making financial decisions that went beyond the scope of necessary estate management. She liquidated your father's retirement accounts prematurely, incurring substantial tax penalties. She sold his house to a private buyer for significantly less than market value. She transferred large sums to accounts that I cannot trace. Mr. Harrison pulled out a bank statement and pointed to a series of transactions. These withdrawals total over $180,000. When I asked Vanessa for documentation of how these funds were used for estate purposes, she provided receipts that don't account for the full amounts involved. I stared at the numbers, feeling like the room was tilting sideways. What are you saying? I'm saying that your sister has misappropriated a substantial portion of your father's estate. The inheritance that should have been split equally between you has been reduced to approximately $120,000 total, instead of the $425,000 your father's assets were worth. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The words hit me like physical blows. She stole from me? The legal term is breach of fiduciary duty, but yes, she used her power of attorney to take money that belonged to both of you. I've been trying to get proper accounting for weeks, but she's been avoiding my calls and providing incomplete documentation. I thought about Vanessa's expensive home improvements, her new car, her designer clothes, her family's obviously elevated lifestyle. Everything that had seemed like evidence of Mark's professional success was actually purchased with money stolen from Dad's estate, money that was supposed to be mine. What can we do about it? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when everything inside me was screaming. We need to file a formal complaint with the probate court and demand a complete accounting of all estate transactions. If we can prove misappropriation, the court can order restitution and potentially pursue criminal charges. But first, we need to document everything she's done. Mr. Harrison handed me a legal pad and a pen. I want you to write down everything you remember about her lifestyle changes during your deployment. Any new purchases, home improvements, expensive items that seemed inconsistent with their previous financial situation. Every detail could be important evidence. As I began writing, my hands were shaking with anger and disbelief. Vanessa hadn't just stolen money, she'd stolen it while I was serving my country, while I was risking my life in combat zones, while I was trusting her to protect our father's legacy. She'd used my military service as cover for betraying everything our family was supposed to represent. There's one more thing, Mr. Harrison said quietly. Your father actually modified his will shortly before he died. He added a clause that specifically protects both inheritances from misuse by the power of attorney. If Vanessa had waited for proper probate proceedings, she never would have been able to access your portion of the estate. What does that mean? It means your father suspected something like this might happen. He built in legal protections that Vanessa violated by acting so quickly after his death. That clause might be the key to recovering everything she took. I drove back to Vanessa's house in a daze, my mind reeling with the implications of what Mr. Harrison had revealed. My sister, the woman I'd trusted with my life, my future, my father's memory, had systematically robbed me while I was serving overseas. She'd used my absence to steal my inheritance and then welcomed me home with false sympathy and expensive dinners purchased with my own money. The house looked different when I pulled into the driveway. The beautiful landscaping, the new deck, the luxury outdoor furniture, all of it represented theft, betrayal, the destruction of everything I'd believed about my family. I sat in the car for several minutes, trying to decide how to confront someone who'd proven capable of such calculated deception. When I finally went inside, Vanessa was in the kitchen preparing lunch, humming softly to herself like nothing had changed. She looked up with a bright smile when I entered. How did your meeting go with Mr. Harrison? I hope he was able to clear up whatever paperwork confusion there was. I stared at her, this woman who'd raised me, protected me, loved me, and ultimately betrayed me in the most devastating way possible. We need to talk, I said simply. The smile faded from her face, and for the first time since I'd been home, I saw her real expression: guilt, fear, and the desperate calculation of someone whose lies were finally catching up with them. The confrontation happened in Vanessa's living room, surrounded by the expensive furniture and home improvements that I now knew had been purchased with my inheritance money. I sat on the leather sofa that probably cost more than my army salary for 2 months, while Vanessa perched nervously on the edge of the matching chair, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her designer sweater. "Mr. Harrison showed me the bank records," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "I know what you did, Vanessa. I know you took my inheritance." For a moment, she tried to maintain the pretense. "I don't know what you're talking about. I handled Dad's estate exactly the way we discussed. Everything was done legally, through proper channels. You liquidated his retirement accounts 6 weeks after he died and transferred $180,000 to accounts that can't be traced. You sold his house for below market value to someone who paid in cash. You spent my inheritance on home improvements and luxury items while I was deployed in a combat zone." Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, defiance, and finally something that looked almost like relief. The mask she'd been wearing since I came home finally slipped completely. "You don't understand how hard it's been," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "Do you have any idea what it's like trying to maintain a middle-class lifestyle on Mark's salary? The kids need things: Emma's tuition for private school, Tyler's therapy sessions, the mortgage payments that keep going up every year. So you decided to steal from your sister who was serving overseas." "I didn't steal anything," she snapped, standing up and beginning to pace around the room. "Dad left that money to both of us. I just used my portion early to invest in our family's future. I was going to pay it all back before you got home." The absurdity of her justification was staggering. "Your portion was half of the estate, Vanessa, not the entire inheritance. And you couldn't have paid it back because you spent it on things that can't be returned: home improvements, vacations, luxury items. You were deployed for another 6 months when Dad died. The money was just sitting there earning minimal interest. I saw an opportunity to invest it in real estate and home improvements that would actually appreciate in value. It was smart financial planning, not theft." I stared at her, amazed by her ability to reframe criminal behavior as sound investment strategy. "You forged documents to access money that wasn't yours. You liquidated accounts that belonged to both of us. You violated the power of attorney by using it for personal gain instead of estate management. Everything I did was legal under the power of attorney you signed," she said, crossing her arms defensively. "I had the authority to make financial decisions about Dad's estate. If you didn't want me to have that authority, you shouldn't have given it to me." The victim blaming was breathtaking. She was actually trying to make this my fault for trusting her. "The power of attorney was for emergency estate management, not for you to rob me blind while I was serving my country." "Don't you dare make this about your military service," she said, her voice rising. "You chose to join the army. You chose to deploy overseas. You chose to leave me to handle everything here while you were off playing soldier on the other side of the world." The contempt in her voice when she said playing soldier hit me like a physical blow. This was her real opinion of my military service, my sacrifice, my commitment to something larger than myself. To her, my deployment had been a game, a choice, to abandon my responsibilities rather than a service to my country. I was serving my country, Vanessa. I was doing my duty as a soldier while trusting my sister to protect our father's legacy, and you used that trust to steal from me. "I protected Dad's legacy better than you ever could have," she shot back. "Do you know what would have happened if that money had just sat in probate for months while you were unreachable? Market fluctuations, inflation, administrative fees that would have eaten away at the value. I invested it wisely in appreciating assets. You spent it on luxury items for yourself. That deck didn't appreciate in value. Your new car didn't appreciate in value. The expensive clothes and jewelry and furniture, none of that was an investment. It was theft. She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her calculating her next approach. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to something that sounded almost like pity. You've been living in a war zone for 18 months, Rebecca. You don't understand how the real world works anymore. Everything costs more than it used to. Maintaining a family, a house, a decent standard of living, it's expensive. I was trying to secure our future while you were focused on survival and combat operations. The condescension was infuriating. She was treating me like I was too traumatized by military service to understand basic financial concepts. I understand that you stole $180,000 from me while I was deployed. I understand that you used my absence to rob me of my inheritance. And I understand that you've been lying to me since I got home. I haven't lied about anything important, she said, sitting back down and trying to adopt a reasonable tone. I've been managing a complex financial situation under difficult circumstances. Yes, I made some decisions you might not have approved of, but I was acting in our family's best interests. Our family? Or your family? Because last time I checked, I wasn't invited to participate in the decision to spend my inheritance on your home improvements. Mark chose that moment to come home from work, walking through the front door with his usual cheerful greeting, before realizing he'd walked into the middle of a confrontation. The tension in the room was so thick it was almost visible, and his expression immediately shifted from casual friendliness to wary concern. "Is everything okay?" he asked, looking back and forth between Vanessa and me. "Rebecca's upset about some of the financial decisions I made while she was deployed," Vanessa said, her tone suggesting I was being unreasonable. "She doesn't understand that I was trying to protect our family's assets from market volatility and administrative delays." Mark's face went pale. "Vanessa, you told me that money came from your inheritance. You said Rebecca had agreed to let you invest it in home improvements." The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa stared at Mark with an expression of pure panic, realizing that she'd been caught in another lie. Mark looked between us, understanding dawning in his eyes as he realized what his wife had done. "You told him I agreed to this?" I asked, my voice barely controlled. "You made your husband believe I was a willing participant in your theft?" "It's not theft," Vanessa said weakly, but the fight had gone out of her voice. "I was going to explain everything when you got home. I was going to work out a payment plan to compensate you for the temporary use of your portion." "Temporary use?" Mark said, his voice incredulous. "Vanessa, we spent that money on permanent improvements. The deck, the landscaping, the kitchen, renovation. None of that can be undone. How are you planning to pay Rebecca back?" "I was working on some investment opportunities," she said, not meeting either of our eyes. "Real estate deals that would have generated enough profit to cover everything. It was all going to work out." The fantasy element of her planning was becoming clear. She'd spent money she didn't have on the assumption that she could somehow generate enough income to cover her theft before I returned from deployment. It was the kind of magical thinking that characterized gambling addicts and pyramid scheme participants. "What investment opportunities?" Mark pressed. "You've been unemployed for 3 years. What deals were you working on?" "I've been taking online courses in day trading and cryptocurrency investment," she said defensively. "I've been learning about market opportunities that could generate substantial returns in short time periods." Mark put his head in his hands. "Oh my God, Vanessa. You spent Rebecca's inheritance on get-rich-quick schemes?" "They're not schemes. They're legitimate investment strategies," she insisted. "I've been studying market patterns and algorithmic trading systems. With the right approach, you can generate returns that far exceed traditional investment vehicles." The conversation was deteriorating into absurdity. She'd stolen my inheritance to fund home improvements and fantasy investment, plans that had no basis in reality. She'd lied to her husband about my participation, created elaborate justifications for criminal behavior, and convinced herself that day trading courses would somehow generate enough money to cover her theft. "How much did you lose?" I asked quietly. "I haven't lost anything," she said quickly. "Some of the initial investments haven't performed as well as projected, but that's normal in volatile markets. The key is maintaining a long-term perspective and not panicking when short-term fluctuations create temporary setbacks." "How much, Vanessa?" Mark was staring at his wife with growing horror. "The savings account is empty," he said slowly. "I checked the balance last week and there was less than $1,000. I thought you'd moved the money to a higher yield investment account." "I did move it to higher yield investments," she said. "Some of those investments are in temporary decline, but the fundamentals remain strong. Market corrections are normal parts of investment cycles." The euphemisms and financial jargon couldn't hide the obvious truth. She'd gambled away not only my inheritance money, but also their family savings on cryptocurrency and day trading schemes that had predictably failed. The expensive home improvements had been financed by theft, and then she'd compounded the crime by losing even more money on speculative investments. "You lost everything," I said, the full scope of her betrayal finally becoming clear. "You didn't just steal my inheritance. You gambled it away, and then lost your own family's savings trying to cover up what you'd done." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Vanessa sat in her expensive chair, surrounded by luxury items purchased with stolen money, while her husband stared at her with the expression of a man who'd just realized he was married to a stranger. The family I'd trusted to protect my father's legacy had destroyed it completely, and then tried to cover their crimes with lies and fantasy investment schemes. The worst part was the realization that this had all been planned. The power of attorney, the rushed financial decisions immediately after Dad's death, the elaborate home improvements completed while I was unreachable overseas, none of it had been impulsive. Vanessa had systematically robbed me while I was serving my country, and then welcomed me home with false sympathy and expensive dinners purchased with my own stolen money. The days following the confrontation felt like living in a house made of lies that was slowly collapsing around us. Mark had moved into their guest bedroom, barely speaking to Vanessa, except for essential communication about the children. Emma and Tyler could sense the tension but didn't understand it, asking why Daddy seemed sad and why Aunt Becca looked angry all the time. The atmosphere was suffocating, but I needed to stay long enough to document everything before taking legal action. I spent hours photographing the home improvements, researching the costs of similar projects, and building a comprehensive record of how my inheritance money had been spent. The new deck alone had cost nearly $15,000 according to receipts I found in Vanessa's filing cabinet. The kitchen renovation, completed just 2 months after Dad's death, had run another $22,000. Every luxury item in their house represented a piece of my stolen future. Mr. Harrison had recommended hiring a forensic accountant to trace all the financial transactions, but that would cost money I didn't have. My Army savings account contained enough to cover basic living expenses for a few months, but legal fees and investigation costs would quickly exhaust my resources. The irony wasn't lost on me that I needed money to recover the money that had been stolen from me. Carmen Rodriguez, my closest friend from high school, became my lifeline during this period. She'd become a successful real estate agent in Knoxville and had maintained connections throughout East Tennessee. When I called, her explaining my situation, she drove down immediately with a bottle of wine and the kind of righteous anger that only comes from true friendship. "I never liked Vanessa," Carmen said bluntly as we sat in a coffee shop away from the toxic atmosphere of the house. "Even in high school, she had this way of making everything about herself. Remember when your mom was going through chemo and Vanessa kept posting on social media about how hard it was on her? Not on your mom, not on you, but on her?" I hadn't remembered that detail, but Carmen was right. Vanessa had always positioned herself as the primary victim in other people's tragedies, finding ways to make their suffering about her emotional burden. The pattern had been there for years, but I'd interpreted it as empathy rather than narcissism. "She's Been planning this since before your dad died, Carmen continued. Think about it. She suggested the power of attorney arrangement months before he had his heart attack. She positioned herself to have complete control over his assets before anyone knew he was at risk. The observation sent chills down my spine. Had Vanessa somehow known about Dad's health problems before the rest of us? He'd been having minor issues, high blood pressure, occasional chest pain he'd attributed to heartburn, but nothing that seemed immediately life-threatening. Or had she simply been opportunistic, setting up systems that would benefit her if something happened to Dad while I was deployed? Carmen offered to help investigate Vanessa's financial activities using her real estate connections and business networks. I know people who can trace property sales, bank transfers, investment accounts. We can build a case that will make it impossible for her to claim this was just poor financial management. That afternoon, we visited Dad's former house, which Vanessa had sold for $140,000 to a cash buyer named David Fletcher. The property was worth at least $180,000 according to recent comparable sales, meaning she'd essentially given away $40,000 of inheritance money for the convenience of a quick sale. Carmen knew the buyer's agent and discovered that Fletcher was a house flipper who'd paid below market value specifically because Vanessa was desperate to sell quickly. She basically advertised that she needed fast cash, Carmen explained as we drove through the neighborhood. Fletcher knew he could lowball the offer because she couldn't wait for the normal selling process. It's exactly what predatory investors look for: distressed sellers who don't understand their property value. The realizations kept building. Vanessa hadn't just stolen money. She'd been incompetent in her theft, making decisions that maximized her immediate cash flow while minimizing the overall value of Dad's estate. She'd liquidated retirement accounts early, incurring massive tax penalties. She'd sold property below market value to access quick cash. She'd made every possible mistake that someone with actual financial knowledge would have avoided. That evening, I found Vanessa in the kitchen making dinner with mechanical precision, her movements sharp and defensive. Mark was at the dining room table helping Tyler with homework while Emma practiced piano in the living room. The domestic scene would have been peaceful if not for the underlying tension that made every interaction feel forced and brittle. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, I said, sitting down across from her at the kitchen island. I want to understand how you thought this was going to work long term. She looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, her knife pausing mid-motion. What do you mean? Your plan to pay me back before I returned from deployment. Even if your investment schemes had worked perfectly, you spent the money on permanent home improvements. How were you planning to repay $180,000 while maintaining your lifestyle and supporting your family? The question seemed to catch her off guard. I told you, I was working on investment opportunities that would have generated substantial returns. The cryptocurrency market has incredible potential for rapid growth if you understand technical analysis and market timing. Did you actually make any money from cryptocurrency trading, or did you just lose more of our inheritance? Her silence was answer enough. The knife resumed its mechanical chopping, but her hands were shaking slightly. Short-term market volatility doesn't reflect long-term investment potential. Successful traders understand that you have to weather temporary downturns to achieve significant gains. The financial jargon was obviously memorized from online courses or YouTube videos. She was reciting investment advice without understanding the underlying concepts, like someone who'd learned a foreign language from phrase books without grasping grammar or context. Show me your trading account, I said simply. What? If you've been making legitimate investments with my inheritance money, show me the account statements. Let me see the trading history, the current positions, the profit and loss statements. Her face went through several expressions before settling on defensive anger. I don't have to prove anything to you. Those accounts contain sensitive financial information that isn't your business. It became my business when you used my inheritance money to fund those accounts. Either show me the statements or admit that you gambled away everything you stole. From me. Mark appeared in the kitchen doorway, apparently having heard our conversation from the dining room. Vanessa, just show her the accounts. If you've been making legitimate investments, the statements will prove it. Those accounts are in my name, she said, her voice rising. They're private financial instruments that don't require disclosure. To family members. They're accounts funded with stolen money, I replied. That makes them evidence of criminal activity, not private investments. The word criminal seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Stop calling it criminal. I'm your sister. I was trying to help our family by making smart financial decisions during a difficult time. You helped yourself to money that wasn't yours while I was serving overseas. That's the definition of criminal behavior, Vanessa. Tyler appeared in the kitchen carrying his homework folder, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. Mom, I need help with my math problems, he said, tugging on Vanessa's sweater. Not right now, baby, she said, her voice strained. Ask Daddy to help you. Daddy's on the phone, Tyler persisted. It sounded like a business call. Mark had indeed stepped outside to take a call, leaving us alone with the children. Emma had stopped practicing piano and was standing in the living room doorway, watching us with the wide-eyed awareness that children develop when their world starts to feel unstable. Why don't you kids go watch TV upstairs for a little while? I suggested gently. The grown-ups need to finish talking about some boring paperwork. They disappeared up the stairs with the eager compliance of children, who sensed they didn't want to hear whatever the adults were discussing. As soon as we were alone again, Vanessa's composure cracked completely. You're going to destroy my family, she whispered, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. Mark's already talking about separation. The kids don't understand why everyone's fighting. You're going to ruin everything because you can't forgive a mistake. I'm not destroying your family, Vanessa. You destroyed it when you decided to steal from me. You destroyed it when you lied to your husband about where the money came from. You destroyed it when you gambled away our inheritance on cryptocurrency schemes. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she sobbed. I was going to make enough money to pay everything back with interest. You would have been better off because I would have grown your inheritance instead of just letting it sit in low-yield accounts. The delusion was complete. She'd convinced herself that theft was actually a form of investment management, that stealing my money was somehow benefiting me. The rationalization was so elaborate and divorced from reality that I wondered if she actually believed it. Mark came back inside, his face grim. That was my supervisor at the credit union. Someone filed a complaint about my wife's financial activities. They're launching an internal investigation that could cost me my job. Vanessa stared at him in horror. Who would file a complaint? Someone who knows about the estate situation, he said, looking directly at me. Someone who's concerned about potential financial crimes involving a credit union employee's family. I hadn't filed any complaints yet, but apparently word was spreading through the local business community. Small towns don't keep secrets well, especially when those secrets involve substantial amounts of money and respected families falling apart publicly. This is what happens when you steal money in a small community, I said quietly. People talk, people ask questions, people start wondering how a credit union assistant manager's family suddenly acquired luxury items worth more than his annual salary. The social consequences were beginning to cascade beyond our family conflict. Mark's professional reputation was at risk. Their children would eventually learn that their comfortable lifestyle had been built on criminal activity. The expensive home improvements that had seemed like symbols of success were becoming evidence of theft. We need to figure out how to fix this before it gets worse, Mark said, sitting down heavily at the kitchen table. Vanessa, you need to tell us exactly how much money is left and where it's located. We need to start making concrete plans to pay Rebecca back, even if it means selling everything we bought with her inheritance. There's nothing left to pay back with, Vanessa admitted finally. The trading accounts are empty. The home improvements can't be undone. The money is gone. The confession hung in the air like a death sentence. She'd stolen my entire inheritance, gambled it away on speculative investments, and spent what remained on luxury items that couldn't be returned or resold for anywhere near their original cost. The systematic destruction of Dad's legacy was complete. But as devastating as the financial loss was, the betrayal ran deeper than money. Vanessa had revealed herself to be someone entirely different from the sister I'd thought I knew. The woman who'd raised me, protected me, and earned my complete trust had been capable of calculated theft, elaborate deception, and the complete destruction of everything our father had worked to build for us. The worst part was realizing that she felt no genuine remorse. Her tears were for herself, for the consequences she was facing, not for what she'd done to me or to Dad's memory. She was still trying to position herself as the victim, someone who'd made unfortunate investment decisions rather than someone who'd committed systematic theft against her own sister. The revelation about Dad's hidden clause came 3 days later, delivered through a phone call from Mr. Harrison that would change everything. I was sitting in the parking lot of a Walmart, having just purchased the cheapest laptop I could find to start documenting my case, when my phone rang with his familiar number. "Rebecca, I need you to come to my office immediately," he said, his voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard before. "I've discovered something in your father's will that we missed during the initial probate review, something that could completely change the situation with your inheritance." The drive to his office felt endless, my mind racing through possibilities. Had Dad hidden assets that Vanessa hadn't discovered? Had he created some kind of trust that protected part of the inheritance? The hope felt dangerous after so many devastating revelations, but I couldn't stop myself from imagining scenarios where not everything was lost. Mr. Harrison's office looked different this time, less like a comfortable small-town law practice and more like a war room. Legal documents were spread across every surface, and he'd clearly been working late into the night based on the coffee cups and scattered papers covering his desk. "Your father was more concerned about potential problems than any of us realized," he began, pulling out a thick manila folder. "3 months before he died, he came to me with very specific concerns about protecting both inheritances from potential misuse." He opened the folder to reveal documents I'd never seen before, handwritten notes in Dad's familiar scrawl alongside typed legal amendments. He'd been reading about cases where military families had their estates mismanaged during deployments. He was worried about what would happen if something occurred while you were unreachable overseas. What kind of protections did he put in place? A clause that requires unanimous agreement from both beneficiaries before any major financial decisions can be made regarding the estate. More importantly, a provision that automatically voids any transaction made without proper authorization from both parties. My heart started beating faster. Does that mean Vanessa's transactions were illegal from the beginning? Not just illegal, legally void. According to this clause, every major financial decision she made without your explicit written consent can be reversed through court action. The house sale, the retirement account liquidations, the investment transfers, all of it can be undone. The implications were staggering. Dad had essentially built a legal time machine that could undo months of Vanessa's theft and financial mismanagement. He'd anticipated exactly what had happened and created mechanisms to protect both of us from it. "There's more," Mr. Harrison continued, pulling out another set of documents. "Your father also established a separate account that Vanessa never discovered, a secondary inheritance fund that was specifically protected from power of attorney access. He showed me bank statements for an account I'd never heard of, containing $87,000 that had been growing with interest since Dad's death. He called it the emergency backup fund in his notes, money set aside specifically for situations where the primary inheritance might be compromised." I stared at the numbers, hardly believing what I was seeing. Not only could we potentially recover everything Vanessa had stolen, but there was additional money she'd never even known existed. Dad had been planning for this exact scenario, protecting his daughter's futures from threats he'd somehow foreseen. "How do we activate these protections?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "We file a motion with the probate court to void all unauthorized transactions and recover the misappropriated assets." Given the clear language of your father's will and the documentation we have of Vanessa's violations, the court should rule in your favor relatively quickly. The legal process began immediately. Mr. Harrison filed emergency motions that same afternoon, requesting court orders to freeze any remaining accounts Vanessa might have access to and beginning the process of asset recovery. The hidden clause gave us extraordinary legal power to unwind months of financial damage in ways I hadn't thought possible. But the most satisfying part was watching Vanessa's reaction when the court papers were served. I was at Carmen's apartment when it happened. Having moved out of Vanessa's house the day before, Carmen had insisted I stay with her family while the legal proceedings moved forward, understanding that remaining under the same roof as someone who'd robbed me was neither safe nor psychologically healthy. Carmen's husband answered his phone. Around 6 that evening, listened for a moment, then handed it to me with a grin. "It's Mark. He sounds like he needs to talk to you." "Rebecca, what the hell did you do?" Mark's voice was strained and panicked. "Vanessa's upstairs crying hysterically. There are court papers saying all her financial transactions are being reversed. She keeps saying something about your dad's will having secret clauses that void everything she did. Dad protected both our inheritances from exactly what Vanessa did to me," I said calmly. "The will contains provisions that make her transactions legally invalid. We're recovering everything she stole, plus penalties and interest." "Is this real? Can the court actually force her to return money that's already been spent?" "The court can order asset seizure, wage garnishment, and sale of property purchased with stolen funds. The deck, the kitchen renovation, your new car, everything bought. With my inheritance, money can be repossessed and sold to satisfy the court judgment." The silence on the other end lasted so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. When Mark finally spoke again, his voice was hollow. "She told me the trading accounts still had money in them. She said she was working on recovering the losses through new investment strategies. There's no money left, Mark. She gambled away everything she stole from me, plus your family's savings. But Dad's will gives us the power to recover it all through legal action against the assets she purchased." That evening, Vanessa called me directly for the first time since the confrontation. Her voice was raw from crying, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. "Rebecca, please. We can work this out privately. You don't need to involve the courts. I'll find a way to pay you back. I promise." "With what money, Vanessa? You already admitted that everything is gone." "I'll get a job. I'll take out loans. I'll sell whatever needs to be sold. But please don't let them take our house. The kids don't deserve to lose their home because of my mistakes." The plea was manipulative, but also revealing. She was finally acknowledging that what she'd done were mistakes, rather than sound investment strategies. But she was still trying to avoid the full consequences of her actions by appealing to my sympathy for her children. "The house was purchased with money you stole from me," I said firmly. "If you lose it, that's a consequence of your criminal behavior, not my legal action." The kids go to school in this district. Emma has friends here. Tyler's in a special therapy program that's only available locally. Moving would destroy their stability and social connections. Maybe you should have considered those factors before you decided to steal my inheritance to pay for home improvements. The conversation ended with her sobbing apologies and promises she couldn't keep. But I felt no satisfaction in her distress, only a cold determination to see justice done and Dad's legacy properly honored. The court proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. Within 2 weeks, we had preliminary orders freezing Vanessa's access to any remaining accounts and beginning the asset recovery process. The house sale to David Fletcher was voided, forcing him to return the property to the estate. The retirement. Account liquidations were reversed, with penalties charged back to Vanessa personally. Most importantly, the court ordered a complete forensic accounting of all estate transactions, paid for by seizing and selling the luxury items Vanessa had purchased with stolen money. Her new car, expensive jewelry, designer furniture, everything was cataloged, appraised, and scheduled for liquidation. The hidden fund Dad had established provided immediate cash flow for legal expenses and living costs while the recovery process continued. For the first time since coming home from deployment, I had financial stability and hope for the future Dad had wanted me to have. Carmen threw a small celebration when the preliminary court orders were finalized. "Your dad was a genius," she said, raising a glass of wine and toast. "He knew exactly what kind of person Vanessa was, even if the rest of us didn't see it clearly." The observation was painful, but probably accurate. Dad had worked with people his entire life, understanding human nature through decades of managing employees, negotiating with customers, and observing how individuals behaved under financial pressure. He'd recognized something in Vanessa that family loyalty had prevented me from seeing, but the legal victory felt incomplete without accountability for the emotional damage she'd caused. The money could be recovered, the assets could be returned, but the betrayal of trust and destruction of family relationships couldn't be undone through court orders. The woman who'd raised me, protected me, and earned my complete devotion had revealed herself to be someone entirely different. That loss was permanent, irreversible, and more devastating than any financial theft could have been. Still, as I reviewed the court documents that evening, I felt something approaching peace for the first time since coming home from deployment. Dad's final gift hadn't just been money, it had been justice, protection, and proof that even from beyond the grave, he was still looking out for his daughters. The hidden clause wasn't just a legal mechanism. It was a message that he'd understood the risks, planned for the worst-case scenario, and made sure that family loyalty couldn't be weaponized to destroy the legacy he'd worked so hard to build. The final hearing took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 6 months after I'd returned from Afghanistan. Vanessa sat at the defendant's table looking hollow and defeated, while Mark held divorce papers he'd filed the week before. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive: full restitution, asset forfeiture, and criminal charges pending. But the real satisfaction came from an unexpected source. "There's one more thing," Mr. Harrison said as we left the courthouse. "Your father left a sealed letter to be opened only if these legal protections were ever activated." Inside the envelope was Dad's familiar handwriting. "Rebecca, if you're reading this, then someone tried to take what you earned through your service to our country. I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I made sure your inheritance would be protected from anyone who might mistake your kindness for weakness. Use this money to build the life you deserve. Love, Dad." 6 months later, I opened my photography studio in downtown Maryville, funded entirely by my recovered inheritance. The grand opening featured a memorial wall honoring local veterans, including a portrait of Dad in his Army uniform from Vietnam. Vanessa was serving 18 months for embezzlement, her children now living with Mark's parents while he rebuilt his life. The hidden clause had given me more than financial security. It had given me justice, closure, and proof that even in death, Dad was still protecting his daughters, not from the world, but from each other when necessary. Sometimes family loyalty requires legal action. Sometimes love means holding people accountable. And sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the knowledge that someone believed in you enough to plan for your future, even when they couldn't be there to protect it themselves. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more real stories about family, justice, and finding strength when the people you trust most let you down.